So yeah, so we're going to be covering kind of the state of privacy right now, what people are thinking about, and then certainly going forward, in the idea of resetting everything. And I just want to take a moment to let our panelists introduce themselves. And I think that's a great jumping off point. So I think Steve and Harry and everybody, if you want to start out and just introduce yourselves, what your work entails, and then talk just a little bit about how this pandemic has affected you personally. I think we're all kind of struggling to figure out how to answer the question, how are you these days?
Hey, Ben. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well under the circumstances. I'm doing remarkably well. We are doing well in Australia. It's a good place to be. And I say that with great respect and self-consciousness. You probably know that Australia and New Zealand are doing well at the moment. Look, I'm only going to say at this stage that I'm a digital identity and privacy and data protection analyst, commentator. I run a small business here in Sydney, where it's the middle of the night, you can probably see. And I'm affiliated with Constellation Research in Silicon Valley. Great to be here. Thanks.
I'll go next. My name is Greg Mcmullen. I'm a lawyer based in Vancouver, Canada. I started out doing class actions, mostly involving privacy, but moved into the blockchain world as chief policy officer with Big Chain DB, now Ocean Protocol. Since then, I've moved back to Canada and I've been doing freelance legal work, but with a focus on researching police use of artificial intelligence and geolocation information.
And Harry, over to you.
So I'm Harry Halpin. I'm a CEO of NIM Technologies, which is a privacy company. And we basically are using the blockchain to enable a next generation privacy infrastructure similar to Tor or a VPN, but that's resistant against global passive adversaries. So that would be someone who's monitoring the entire network. And we've also been involved, and our advisors are leading the European effort to build privacy enhancing Corona tracking apps. And just before that, I worked at INRIA, MIT, a few other places, and I have a PhD in computer science.
Great. And again, thank you all for being here. So I think we'll just start out this panel. I'll lead off with a really general question, but I think it's important, how has this pandemic made you what has it made you start thinking differently about? And has it shifted any of your priorities? This can be generally, but also within the context of privacy and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, look, Ben, I'm the first to admit that this really has shifted my priorities. I'm in my 50s. I think I've had a long life to date. I thought that I'd seen a lot around the world, but this is the sort of thing that you don't see outside of the movies normally. My mother's in her 80s. She lived through the Great Depression and was a child in the Second World War, and her perspective has been interesting to me. And we ran out of toilet paper in Australia pretty early on. My mother said that she never saw toilet paper until she was in her 30s. And so her perspective was, we don't know hardship. But my God, we do now. We're very lucky in Australia. I have to pinch myself. I think, coming off the back of the media discussion that we've just had as well, I think that we are so dulled, our senses are so dulled about disasters, tsunamis and fires and true catastrophes, that the numbers become unreal. And I have to pinch myself at the scale of death and destruction around the world and remind myself that, shit's getting real. Now, I want to come back to some things shortly about compromises and about how the way that my values have changed as a privacy advocate. They really have changed in recent weeks. The one observation I want to make, and I don't want to make this about Australia, but we are doing very well. We have been shocked. I have been shocked as a libertarian, well, quasi-libertarian. I have been shocked at the shift in our conservative government. We have a fiscally conservative, socially conservative government that has done an amazing job with an economic rescue package. Australia has gone from a neutral budget to going into significant national debt now. Overnight, we have taken on 10 to 20% of GDP as national debt, and we have done that off the basis of a very fiscally conservative government. So this government has actually, without any pomp and ceremony and without a lot of politics, has backed away from deeply held ideological positions. And I want to talk later on in this session about the compromises that I think are involved with privacy policy and privacy philosophy. And I find myself in the middle of that. For the first time in 25 years of working in privacy, I have held highly principled positions. And look, I'm going to use some really filthy language on this session. I'm going to use the word pragmatism.
No, I think that's definitely going to be a big part of this conversation, is the trade-offs that people around the world are having to make right now, and particularly in relation to privacy. But Greg and Harry, I want to turn it over to you in case you want to jump in on that initial question about how this has, shaped your priorities, maybe shifted them, or made you start thinking about things within a different framework.
Well, I think the first half of my professional and my entire adult life, I guess, has been shaped by 9/11. Drove my interest in civil liberties. It essentially pushed me into studying law. And I think this is going to shape the second half. But the commonality, I think, is that right after 9/11, we saw this massive increase in state power, like a grab for new surveillance technologies. This is where the bulk surveillance programs really took off in all the English-speaking countries around the world, and I think in other countries as well. So I think that's something we really need to watch for here. Any crisis like this is definitely an opportunity for people to push certain agendas. And when people are frightened like this, they're more likely to agree to something that seems like a sensible temporary emergency measure that then just sticks around for decades. So that's kind of what I'm watching for. And I can see it in myself. Like, I look out the window, and when I see police or bylaw officers, my first instinct is usually, I don't want them to be here. But now it's, why aren't you talking to those 4 people who are not obeying social distancing? So I think we all have this sort of rising authoritarian voice in our minds, and we need to be really careful guarding against that.
Yeah, and I would go maybe for a contradictory opinion, which is that I don't actually think the Corona crisis basically means that due for our own good, we should destroy our civil liberties. I think that's a very dangerous viewpoint. And the reason is, as such, is that I think a lot of us, including people who are born in this, in the 1900s at least, which is everyone who's currently alive, often assume our civil liberties are to be taken for granted. But actually, they were the process of a long historical struggle by people from all around the globe. And this involved revolutions in many countries in order to give people these civil liberties. And a lot of people died in defense of those civil liberties and those fundamental freedoms, which most of humanity since, didn't have for thousands of years. Only the privileged and the few have them. So I think it's a historic achievement. And that I think to roll those back because we believe that there's a pandemic which is killing a lot of people, which is true. But then if you look at it in contrast, like historical pandemics, like the plague of Justinian or whatnot, bubonic plague, it's a bad, but it's not end of the world. I think is a bit of a panicked overreaction. So it's better that we preserve our freedoms than not, because once we roll them back due to concerns of coronavirus, I think it's very unlikely they'll ever be given back. Everything we know from 9/11 and also from larger historical circumstances show that whenever there is some sort of emergency, the government basically says, "Oh, it's a state of emergency. We're going to enact these laws, which basically let us choose who lives and who dies," and they never give those back. And I think it's very dangerous to just assume that we today are so special, that our crisis is so special, that we should roll these back. I think we should obviously respect social distancing and do sensible things, but to actually the sort of surveillance-based proposals we've seen coming out of the French government around Stop Co-IVD, the relatively the dangerous things being pushed forward, recently revoked in Israel with Shin Bet, and the other sort of very silly schemes for corona tracing being put forward by MIT and whatnot, using cell phone data. These are all incredibly dangerous, or God help us, facial recognition to track corona. And I think these should all be pushed back against very heavily. I think we can defeat this virus without basically throwing our civil liberties out the window.
And I think that's a really good lead into kind of our next question. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we're grappling with, and the specter of 9/11 is obviously still with us. I'm based in New York City, so obviously here, and we see things like the Patriot Act that are sort of legislative mechanisms that kind of directly led to the enabling of things, like the surveillance by the NSA of metadata and other things that Edward Snowden sort of revealed to the world. And looking at that, the idea of contact tracing is one that I think that we're all becoming more familiar with and maybe weren't previously, but the idea of tracking who comes into contact with who, and if somebody is ill, who have they talked to, who have they interacted with in the last 2 weeks. And that's quite a wide array of people for most people. And our memories just don't cut it quite often. That's traditionally been done through interviews and things like that. But we're people, we forget things. And so we're seeing the rise of digital tools to do this. And Harry, as you alluded to, we're seeing that through Bluetooth on our cell phones that ping other Bluetooths on people's cell phones and keep a log of who we come in contact with. There have been other proposals for using geolocation data for these mechanisms. And then those have been coupled with things like facial recognition and large-scale video surveillance that can be used to detect elevated temperatures to varying degrees of accuracy and these sorts of things. So looking at this wide array of proposals that are going into effect throughout the world, and contact tracing in particular, where does this intersect with privacy? And what are some of the concerns that you all might have around this, as well as what are some of the benefits? What is sort of the best, worst outcome of the options on the table here?
Should we vary the speaking what order we?
Yeah, everybody feel free to jump in, unmute. This is a conversation, obviously.
Okay. So I'll just give my quick opinion on the
Sure.
The tracing. So, historically, manual tracing has been very useful. It's particularly useful if it's done very early on in the process. Now, it's unclear if, just to be very, very upfront, it's unclear if digital contact tracing even works. Like, we may be beyond the point where we can realistically identify and then trace the patterns that cause people to isolate. And a lot of the problems aren't very digital at all. The problems are ones of enforcement. So, for example, and ones of testing. So, for example, I thought I might have got corona after a blockchain conference in Paris and Ethereum CC. I couldn't get a test. A lot of people couldn't get a test. And I may have been positive, I may not have been. It's hard to tell. And the tests for immunities don't seem to be working very well. And what you've seen in countries which have actually used contact tracing successfully, it's unclear how big of a deal contact tracing has been versus, I think, a much simpler criteria, which is isolation. So the corona symptoms usually appear after about, let's say max 2 weeks. So in countries which you think would be being hit very hard by corona, such as Iraq, they force everyone coming in the country out of the airport to go to a hotel. They basically keep the hotel guarded and force them to isolate. And so far, Iraq has had very few corona crises, very few deaths and very few infections due to this very strict quarantine situation they put new travelers in the country on. Now, compared to Europe, where, I was told self-isolate for 2 weeks, right? So there's no one enforcing it. Who knows if I'm going to do it or not? I did it, of course, but a lot of people may not have done it. So I think there's these very basic things which the West is missing. I think it's kind of a little bit crazy to sort of say, oh, we'll just install an app, fixed contact tracing. And then fix corona via contact tracing. And then I think another problem with contact tracing is that a lot of the designs put forward for contact tracing are, I think, even if it did help, which I think the jury's still out if it's even feasible at this point, are not so great in terms of privacy. In fact, some of them are absolutely terrible. So there's basically two families of designs. One is centralized and one is decentralized. And by centralized, it means that whether or not you've met someone who has corona is calculated on your phone, that's a decentralized version, or your machine. In a centralized version, your social network and your graph of who you've met is kept on a central server, and they determine if you've met someone, if you're at risk or not. So inside Europe, the French and German governments were pushing a sort of centralized solution with what's called the PEPPT consortium. And a lot of researchers, including here in Switzerland, put forward a decentralized solution, and so far, the decentralized solution, while is what's supported by Apple and Google, it has not been viewed as obligatory, but is being rolled out by Austria, Estonia, Switzerland, maybe a few other countries. Germany seems to recently switch from centralized to decentralized. And it's not like it's entirely perfectly private. So there's a good critique of the decentralized systems where if you use a decentralized system, maybe like ad tech or surveillance tech, Google and Apple themselves could figure out if you have corona or not. And so the French government, due to concerns over this, produced their own protocol, which is centralized. Because they say, well, you shouldn't trust Google and Apple. You should trust us, the French government, with this database of who's contacted who and who may have corona or not. But there's a law that's, I think, even maybe more dangerous, because historically, a lot of the big dangers we've seen in terms of violation of privacy have not actually come from Google and Apple. I mean, they do ad targeting and whatnot, and they're vulnerable to like letters, NSA letters, not NSA letters, FISA warrants, which basically do allow the NSA to collect their data on the government's behalf. But what we've actually seen in terms of privacy surveillance is that the main bad actors historically been the government itself, and who abuse these data to track down dissidents or whatnot. And that's kind of where the French government's going, and that there seems to be increasing strong pushback against that. So I think if you did do contact tracing, which I'm not even sure you should do, it should be decentralized and privacy enhanced and not obligatory. Because the problem is, even if it would be more effective if it was obligatory, but if we made it obligatory, we would enter a world where it becomes normal that the government tracks our, for our own quote unquote good, tracks our movement constantly, and makes it illegal to go outside without your phone or an app. And I think that's a world that's very dangerous and we don't want. But I can see reasonable people disagreeing.
Yeah, my understanding too is that the decentralized approach, the idea is that it's private by design, right? It's not just a matter of laws or regulations or these sorts of things which can be broken or potentially subverted in times of crises. But, even if a government wanted to overstep in these ways, they wouldn't be able to. And maybe, Greg, I'll kick it over to you there to, given your background with GDPR and the legal aspects of this, and, just kind of point that question to you about what are some of the concerns that you might be having, or what are some of the benefits that we're seeing around these areas, particularly contact tracing. I think you're on mute, Greg.
There we go. I think the first question Harry hit right on, which is, does it even work? There are huge questions about the effectiveness of contact tracing digitally. Like for the reasons that he mentioned, like not everyone has a phone. You have to enforce people bringing their phones. What if people forget their phones? You get a whole lot of inaccuracies that way. For the more decentralized versions, the Bluetooth enabled ones, well, I live in a pretty small apartment. I'm sure my Bluetooth device is talking to my next door neighbor. There's no way for a coronavirus to get through the wall, but there certainly is for Bluetooth signals. So you're going to wind up with a whole lot of false positives. So I think after you've addressed that question of whether it works technically, there's also the question of whether it improves public health. And then you get into the legal questions of how do you actually do it? So I think in order for it to have any effect whatsoever, it would need to be mandated. Because if you've got only a small chunk of the population using it, or multiple competing apps, you wind up with this incomplete data set where people feel like they're safe, but they're actually not, because they have no idea who they talk to.
And trust
so
is
if you are
in all of these, right, in terms of the downloads and stuff like that, I believe it was in Nature, there was a paper that was putting forth that we would need 60% adoption of these apps to make them effective. And so you're right, it is a really big question.
And this is somewhere where platform monopolies might actually be a good thing. I don't usually like to say that, but in a case like this, it might be a good thing if there is one protocol that everyone is using. Now, hypothetically, I don't think it should be mandated, but if it were, I think there's a few things legally that we'd need to think about including. The first would be a really strong sunset provision. So we know that it's not going to just be the new forever, where there is a database wherever it's located of everyone's location information. It should self-destruct at some point. We should go into this planning to delete the data that we do collect, and that should be built into the technology, because once government has a data set like this, it will not want to give it up. There needs to be really strong oversight of how it's used. There's always feature creep with these things. So we collect the data set for one thing and we use it for another. We do surveillance and like bulk metadata collection to stop terrorism, but then we start using it for immigration enforcement and drug enforcement. So we need to write into the law that this cannot be used for other things. And there needs to be oversight in the sense that we have public reports on how it's being used. So if we were even going to consider mandating that people do this, those are the things that would need to be there. But I think it's very dangerous territory to even begin to mandate that.
Yeah, and Steve, you know, we discussed sort of the trade-offs, and you brought up pragmatism initially on this, and so I'd love to get your perspective on this this debate right now. I believe you're on mute, Steve. There, oh, back on mute. Great. Nope, back on mute.
Steve, you're still muted.
It seems to be switching on and off, such as the trials and tribulations.
That is really strange. I wonder if I've got
now you're here.
I will come back to pragmatism a little bit later if you like. The main thing about pragmatism for me is that I want to get people to the table. There is this tremendous polarization at the moment. In Australia, for example, there are privacy advocates, well-meaning privacy advocates, but friends of mine who nevertheless are retreating to their corners, and they will not talk to the government. They don't trust the government. Now, like, you know, Australia, like the UK, like the US, horrible overreach after 9/11. And there are elements of police state, surveillance state creeping into Australian polity, and it's ugly. But with lives on the line, I just want to get people to the table, and that we will at least meet people halfway, especially given that our government has, against all odds, been incredibly pragmatic economically. But look, right now, hearing some tremendous points, and I agree with almost everything from Harry and Greg. I just thought it might be useful. I've just recently blogged about why I'm actually using the contact tracing app in Australia, which is something I never thought I'd do. You know, to be clear, I am allergic to Facebook. I am allergic to ad tracking. I usually use a burner email address for my fitness trackers. I'm pretty obsessive. But the way that I think about it is like this. There are dimensions of decentralization. The starting point for me is that this is a notifiable disease. This is like measles and HIV. And if you catch coronavirus, if you test positive at a clinic, the doctors are required to report your positive test with a whole lot of information to the public health unit of the state health departments in Australia. Our system's broadly very much like the NHS. So that's going to happen. And then you are going to get interviewed. You're going to be called and you're going to be asked to talk about where you were, etc. Now, this is done by nurses and healthcare professionals. And I don't know of any sort of reasonable person who objects to this. You know, it's a bit of a price that we pay for the social compact that we're in. That process is very difficult. And there are well-known problems going back to HIV 25, 30 years ago, where people who did not want, obviously, their sexual status was incredibly sensitive. There were people who did not even want to be gay, who were being asked to talk about their sexual practices and what clubs they were going to. And of course, the incidence of sex was incredibly high and embarrassing. And contact tracing was very, very difficult. Now, I don't think coronavirus is going to be as hard as that, but we're still going to be finding people who are being asked to explain the clubs that they were in last week, if you know what I mean. And so person-to-person contact tracing is very confronting. And there's a very good chance with public health professionals that I talk to, there's a very good chance that anonymous proximity tracing can be a great adjunct. Now, I want to talk about decentralization for a minute. I think this group knows that there's a difference between tracing and tracking, but journalists and policymakers and the public, I think, are still confused about tracing and tracking and surveillance. And there's clearly a spectrum. I think most of the intelligent people and informed people don't want to do tracking, don't want to do GPS, don't want to do surveillance. But the idea of using Bluetooth beacons for proximity tracing is really interesting, because all it's going to do is say, I was close to somebody for 15 minutes, not even tracking the date. I mean, I'm working with solution providers that aren't even keeping the date. They're just saying some point in the last 21 days, which is the incubation period, plus or minus, I was close to somebody for 15 minutes. So I think that is broadly good enough. I think it's providing some really cool privacy enhancing features. Then the question is, and this data has all been kept on my phone. Then the question is, how do you upload the data and make use of it? There's broadly two approaches. There's the fully decentralized approach, which says everybody's app that's participating in this optional process, let's admit it's optional as well, like Greg was saying. I test positive, I tell my app to publish my list of Bluetooth logs, and then every other app is every now and again going to poll that and find that, hey, I'm in the same place at the same time as somebody who tested positive. Hell, I better go and get myself tested. There's a semi-decentralized approach that says when somebody tests positive, instead of publishing that log publicly where people can look at it, send it to the government and put it into the existing contact tracing process, where a nurse is then going to call those people and counsel them to go and get tested. Now, I personally prefer that for a couple of reasons. One, it can do a lot to eliminate the false positives that Greg was talking about. Secondly, it normalizes the technology. There is a question about technology on its own. Is it even going to work? There's no question that contact tracing works. So if you take a proximity log and give it to a trained contact tracing professional, you've got a much better chance of working. The final thing I want to say is that I don't want an app telling me, hey, you've just been near somebody who is positive, go and get tested. That's a really confronting, difficult thing. It takes a lot of healthcare literacy to even know what that means. I think it's much, much better for a nurse, a professional public health unit person, to call people respectfully and in context and give them the counselling that's implicit with a test. And we're good at this in Australia. We've got the New South Wales, state of New South Wales, it's a population of about 7 or 8 million. We have 150 contact tracing professionals full time. And that number has just gone up recently, because normally what they do is that they spend all their time tracing measles. And they've boosted that workforce to deal with COVID. So, I like the semi decentralized approach. Absolutely keep these pseudonymous IDs on your phone, purge them after 21 days, make the app voluntary, and do what we can to encourage, the public participation in this thing to get those numbers up to 60 or 70% participation.
Yeah, and I think even in New York City, we're seeing more of a focus right now on sort of the in-person contact tracing. They're hiring, 1,000 in-person contact tracers as a way to augment these sorts of things. But these digital tools certainly are a part of the conversation for contact tracing in terms of augmenting, what those humans are able to do. And so, Harry, Greg, if one of you all want to jump in here, feel free to. Otherwise, I can take us on to what might be the conversation after contact tracing, because there are going to be issues that we're facing over the next, probably years.
I mean, I would say I agree that it would be better to say call a professional than not.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I'm still a little bit skeptical, mainly because I think contact tracing works when you have some idea of what the infection, like a smaller infection, and you're tracing all the contacts. If a large percentage of the population is already infected, then it's kind of going to be relatively infeasible to do contact tracing.
Yeah, I agree.
Particularly when things like, testing isn't even set up properly, which is, I think, the situation at least we're in the United States, and is also, to be honest, the case in most of Europe as well. It's kind of surprising. I mean, it's amazing that this lockdown has happened, basically put everyone on hold for multiple weeks, and we still don't have decent testing and we still have these capacity issues. Like I mean, what government should have been doing, had they been responsible, is they should have been increasing capacity in the hospitals, increasing the protective equipment, increasing testing, and they've all, you know, instead it just seems like people put a pause button on and assume disease would magically disappear, which I don't think.
Well, some of the leaders expressly said that it would.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's obviously a moron, but I mean, even in countries where they seem to be kind of responsible, they're not, it doesn't seem they're really carrying through with like a lot of the basic measures. And so like in France, there's, you know, this huge debate. They want to have this mandatory or quasi-obligatoire, as they call it, app to install in like 2 weeks. But you've just heard the situation in the hospitals is not, you know, so great. So it's not clear. I mean, I feel like there's still this underlying kind of, I would say, desire for like magic, like the app will magically solve the crisis. While that's, I think that's, I'm pretty skeptical.
Yeah, and could I riff on that for a minute? I hear you.
Sorry, I'm
Harry.
going to jump. I'm just going to jump in for a second there. I think we also have to be aware that for these obligatory state-run apps, there's a difference in participation based on where you are in society. So people with tenuous immigration status don't want to have any sort of state data collection. People in racialized minorities don't want to have any sort of data collection. We already mentioned the HIV epidemic. People who haven't come out don't want to have their sexuality exposed that way. So it's one thing to talk about this will only be used by healthcare professionals, but it feels different to different people in the population. And the impact of any other use is different to different people in the population. And I think that has to be kept in mind for all of this.
And Steve, feel free to jump in. Yep.
Yeah, look, I think those are really good points, and I think that the trust problem that we have is exactly that. Like, how do you get people, minorities with chaotic lives, and absolutely. I wanted to preface my comments before by sort of acknowledging what Harry was saying. Every jurisdiction's different, and my support or even my enthusiasm for contact tracing technology in Australia is about Australia. I'm persuaded, and I absolutely cede the floor to epidemiologists and public health officials who I speak with. But senior people in Australia are talking about the key to normality. So it's a pathway, and it only makes sense when A, you're trying to get back to normal. B, you happen to have the good environmental parameters. So the community incidence of this disease in Australia is really low. And therefore, the contact tracing is not going to get flooded. You're not going to get a whole lot of false alerts. The other thing is that the testing is luckily, touch wood, is widely available in Australia now. So, you know, when you call somebody to get them tested, that's a piece of advice that they can act on. They can also act on it because we have a free public health, universal free public health insurance in Australia. There's not a lot of stigma attached. All things being equal, you know, this is still a generalization. And I know that just free public health doesn't mean accessible public health in all cases. I know that. But it's a numbers game, and in Australia, it is much more accessible than other parts of the world. And so people can act on that advice. And if they get a call out of the blue saying this is the public health unit, by and large, Australians understand that people are here to help. There's not a huge amount of suspicion. There's certainly not a lot of stigma in being able to go to a public hospital and get a lot of free treatment. So yeah, we're lucky that way. With all of those things in place, then I think that the technology can be a useful augmentation.
Yeah, and I think that's a way to maybe lead into the next round of this. Obviously, you know, economies have been shut down kind of across the world. People are under lockdown. People have a really strong desire to try and get back to some sense of normalcy. It's hard to be locked down. It's especially hard, you know, for people who have lost jobs and others like that. And so a number of governments are considering, you know, to varying degrees, the idea of immunity passes, or people who have gotten the virus and have recovered, having some level of antibodies in their systems, which, the hope is that that conveys immunity for some point in time. There's still a number of research and scientists working on trying to get to the bottom of that. But I'd be curious about putting to you all, what maybe some concerns from a privacy perspective, or what kind of the downstream effects might be of issuing people potentially digital passes that would grant them and afford them a level of movement throughout, the economy, but just even out in the larger world when other people might not have those same advantages.
Look, I'll make a couple of technology neutral preemptive comments about this, because I know that we're going to get into some certain tech fairly quickly. The technology neutral position I've got, again, is to try and embed this in existing protocols. Now, there are workplaces where the idea of immunity passbooks are absolutely normal. So every year, nurses, allied health professionals, school teachers need to show that they have hepatitis B immunization, that they have measles, that vaccinations are up to date. So the idea of a vaccination passport, and obviously international travelers will often have to show certificates and pieces of paper as they cross certain borders, depending on your job and depending on circumstances. So the idea that we would all suddenly have an immunity passport because COVID is somehow universal and we don't want people returning to work with the virus, that is a step change. That's a quantum change for most people. And it doesn't matter what technology you use, there's all sorts of problems with that. It's diabolical. But look, I think I don't know whether we use this as a test case to ease our way into this or not, but I absolutely think that where there's a workforce and where there's a substrate that expects people to be immunized, then I can easily see COVID being added to that in terms of protocol and in terms of workplace expectations. And then if we can use smart data carriers to produce verifiable proof that I've got a digital evidence that I've got a certain particular health status, and if I know where that's come from, and if it's tamper resistant and user controlled in some sort of cool data carrier, I think it's certainly worth trying.
I think we also have to consider what we're talking about. If we're talking about an immunization status, that's one thing, because anyone can go and get an immunization. Hopefully that'll be provided for free by governments everywhere. We'll see how it plays out in the States. But it's a totally other thing to base it on antibody testing. Effectiveness aside, we don't know if that will actually work, but basing it on that gives people who need to get back to work an incentive to go and get infected. I think it's a very dangerous thing to propose that we would give people a passport for having an antibody. I think for vaccination, it makes sense. For antibody testing, it's very dangerous and creates this two-tiered society.
We get into those mumps parties, and there were SARS parties, weren't there, 10 years ago, where people would go around deliberately infecting each other for that reason. Do it yourself public health? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I think it's what incentive structures, right, are being put in place and to what effect, and looking at these downstream, concerns and what's going to be playing out, not just right now, but also in the immediate future and then further down the line. And so these are all questions that we need to be answering and thinking about. Harry, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the immunity passport issue, so I have what, at least from the United States, you get this yellow book, basically, which says that I've been, I've taken, hepatitis B, for example, vaccinations. And so that, I think, actually, to some extent, paper book, I'm completely okay with. It could be very useful. I'm nervous about pushing that forward any further. I do think we should encourage people to get tested, but what I think is really dangerous is some of the things I've seen come out. So first thing, it's not clear medically, we still don't know if antibodies really are developed after infection. We don't. I think there's been some cases where people have been reinfected. So I think the entire premise of like an immunity passport is based on knowing facts about corona that we're not quite scientifically sure of. Even if it was the case, I think, and there's some really dangerous technical proposals. So I'm going to bring up one particular I think is just the dumbest idea ever, which is the COVID 19 Credentials Initiative, which basically says everyone should put their credentials on a blockchain. using this W3C verifiable credentials standard. And a bunch of companies, Evernym, I don't know, Georgetown University, et cetera, they mostly seem to be small and relatively scammy, are pushing this initiative. And I'm going to tell you, like, that's a terrible idea. No one should ever do that. It's the only people I know that back the decentralized identifier initiative. I used to work for W3C, and we internally, way before the standard happened, everyone inside W3C who knew anything about privacy, including our lawyers, were like, please, in the name of God, don't standardize this initiative. But fact of the matter is, it did get eventually standardized. And whenever you have like essentially an identity system that's put on a blockchain, it's just like such a privacy nightmare. And they say, oh, it's not that, don't worry, it's pseudonymous, the personal data is kept off chain, et cetera, et cetera. But all of these things we know based on like very basic facts about machine learning can be easily, pseudonymous things can be easily de-anonymized. Even access to documents off chain pattern can be basically figured out, and patterns of access can be figured out. And often the metadata is more powerful than the data. That's why, as a company, we're working on solutions at NimTech to prevent metadata analysis, the analysis of who's talking to who and when. But none of this stuff is built in. It's all pretty hard. And it's definitely not built into public-facing blockchain. So there's these initiatives that kind of sound good, like decentralized identity sounds really good. It has this kind of tone of liberation. And decentralized identity to like stop Corona sounds even better. And it's self-sovereign, like somehow I'm in charge. But then you realize when you look at technically what they're asking for, it's like, I want to put my Corona test results on a document whose access control is ran by a public blockchain. That's just like a privacy nightmare, hands down. So even though it sounds, even though it sounds really good, it's one of the worst. It's like almost comically bad idea that I thought was a joke when I first heard about it. And I was like, oh God, it's true. And if you look at the people who actually are using these kinds of technologies, look at who's using decentralized identifiers. There is one major client right now is the Department of Homeland Security, right? So why does in the United States, and their main goal is to track immigrants, and we've seen how Trump has abused that. Why would we assume that it's going to be any better with Corona? And then I honestly think there's a lot of difference between various governments. Like Australia seems to be doing a pretty good job. Switzerland, I have a lot of trust in the local canton. But then it's really funny when I hear like these like kind of, I don't know, how do you say, like this recent article about, how do we stop Corona disinformation? These Harvard professors say, oh, we should put the government in charge of controlling information. I'm like, have you seen in the United States who the government is? It's Trump. Like, it's not like maybe under Obama, like a reasonable person could say, oh, well, maybe the NSA is not that bad. Maybe surveillance isn't that bad. But then when your government's ran by these like people who are not very bright and have very clear authoritarian tendencies, if not dangerous authoritarian behavior, you don't want to hand them infrastructure. So
I'm going to jump in with a thought about disinformation. I think that's going to be, you asked what happens after Corona. I think that is going to be the focus, or one of the focuses, and it's going to be used as an excuse to ban end-to-end encryption. We don't see what's going on inside these encrypted chat networks. Governments are going to add this to the usual anti-terror, child protection. Now it'll be disinformation prevention as an argument to ban strong encryption. And that's going to be something we need to watch out for.
Yeah, and I think these are all definitely things, Harry, you covered a lot of ground there, and Greg, you bring up a really good point around end-to-end encryption. These are all tools, and these are all issues that we're going to be talking, in the months to come. I'm going to keep reporting on them. Y'all are going to keep working on them. I think right now we need to hit the pause button, though, because we could do panels on each of those separate areas in some ways, and pivot to attendee questions just to see what, they would like to hear from you all about. So, Alex, I'm going to open up this to you, and feel free to coordinate what we might be hearing from attendees.
Sure. Thank you so much for this discussion, Harry, Steve, Ben, Greg. It was really awesome. So stay tuned. We have 15 minutes of Q&A. So everyone, please ask your question in the Q&A box. I know there's a few already. If you want to talk, please raise your hands and I will unmute you so we can carry on this discussion. No, does anyone want to ask a question? Otherwise, I can read the question. Oh, someone wants to talk. Okay, Martin. Let's go. You're muted. Hello. Martin, can you hear us?
We can't hear him, that's for sure.
Oh, okay. Well, we can wait because we've got a few questions actually. So the first one is from Kibitz, who's allowed to talk if he wants to. But his question was, historically, security and governments aren't successfully combined with whistleblowers, identities of agent, physical location of leaders. Is there truly a way to protect ourselves from ourselves when there are already laws in many countries that have been broken with regards to identity security with no repercussions? Does anyone want to take that question on?
I mean, I'll say one thing really quickly, which is this is why I really do push for strong encryption and decentralized technology in terms of blockchain solutions. So, you know, at the same point, like I'm not going to pretend these technologies are going to be used for nice things. Obviously, if you're going to develop, for example, a decentralized Indian encrypted social network, you shouldn't be surprised if like the first people to use it are going to be like 5G conspiracy theorists or you know, Nazis that are banned from other platforms. That being said, you never know what the future is going to be. And you do need these platforms in case there's surveillance and censorship of yourself. And you know, you never know, someone who's viewed as very crazy might be using these platforms, but you yourself and other people who you view as very rational will also possibly have their free speech repressed. And ultimately, I think the solution to these problems of free speech is not to say free speech itself is a problem, but to have technologies to basically make free speech invulnerable to government repression, even well-intentioned repression. And that's ultimately because even the most trusted government can change in the future. So you need to have decentralized technology essentially as a backstop to prevent kind of 1984 and authoritarian kinds of solutions. Even if they seem like it seems like an overkill today, it's probably not going to be overkill.
Makes sense. Right. So other questions. Does William, who's there before, maybe I can admit you so you can ask your question. William, you can talk right now.
Sure. I've heard about this proposal, and it sounds nice in that, well, better than some sort of centralized government proposal for these apps. But my concern right now isn't so much to do with the app or the technology. It's to do with the biology. The market is totally flooded with a lot of really crappy antibody tests, and it's good to have something like this, you know, waiting in the wings right now. But I'm not sure that there's enough understanding on the technology side of just how bad a lot of these tests are in how they work in the lab. They have poor sensitivity, poor specificity, and released into the public, you could have, you know, orders of magnitude more false positives than you do true positives. And of course, for some people that would be a feature, not a bug. So my question is really, how much visibility do you think there is on the side of the technologists working on these protocols about like how good the tests actually are clinically?
So I'm happy to jump in here briefly. You know, I think what's key is I've been talking to a lot of technologists that are working on these sorts of things, just about the process, and a lot of them, almost all of them, are in touch with epidemiologists and working closely in concert with them, particularly if they are coordinating with governments or on regional levels and things like that. You know, in the US, where I'm based, the FDA did, you know, kind of speed some tests to market or allow that. And so we are sort of dealing with some of the fallout. Some of these tests are accurate. Some of them might not be as accurate. That's something that's continually being updated and debated and played out. And that's going to be the case, you know, for months going forward as well. So everybody I've talked to, they are working on the medical side and they do have those insights. But I think you do raise a good point in the sense that, the idea of contact tracing, like if you don't have a reliable test that can alert somebody to the fact that there has been contact or that somebody was infected, it just becomes another form of de facto tracing. And that's something that, people I talk to are quite concerned about. And just keeping that in mind. That being said, I'm certainly not a doctor or a scientist in this regard. And so I'm hesitant to comment on, anything directly in terms of test accuracy. Those differ from country to country, and there are people that are better placed to speak to that than myself. But, from the tech side, happy to comment on that. And then, anybody else that wants to hop in, feel free.
I mean, I would like to say, there is the possibility these tests don't seem like perfect. And there's no clear route to vaccination. So some people said, oh, we've done a lot of work on SARS, but then also like none of the vaccines being tested so far with human subjects seem to have worked. And there's some evidence that maybe vaccination will be difficult. The virus will probably mutate and become less dangerous over time. But the underlying cause of the virus, which is, in China, there was destruction of natural habitats, bats mated with a pig or whatever, and at least the virus jumped from bat to pig and then got into the human ecosystem. There was a letter recently by ecologists saying this thing's going to increase. Maybe not corona, there might be many, many more viruses as the destruction of the natural world increases over time. So even maybe while the corona pandemic might on some level get under control, there might be a new one next year or later this year or in a few years. We don't know. And I think we might have to just get ourselves used to a world in which case there are pandemics, maybe with incurable diseases. But this is not, it sounds really scary, but it's a world that most of humanity lived in for a very long time, up until, maybe the early 1920, 1930. And it might be a kind of world we're going to return to, where there just are pandemics. And I think the question is there a way to prevent death from pandemic? And I would actually say it's really unfortunate, but I think probably no, that we may just enter a world where there are more incurable diseases. And the question is, what are we willing to sacrifice to kind of make people live longer? And I think we should obey scientific advice, and we should work with scientists. But then at the same point, there might not be a return to normalcy. And I'm actually more worried about the authoritarian over-response to pandemics than pandemics, because I think as such, humanity's survived a bunch of pandemics, and it could be really bad, and it's probably going to get worse. But that's just something that, is outside of our control. It's a biological reality.
Awesome. We actually have room for a few more questions. So one question is by Philip Long on the Q&A box. Philip, do you want to talk right now? You are permitted to if you want. Or maybe it will just be, I guess it's on brand with the panel of privacy that people just keep asking questions anonymously. So that's fine. I guess everyone can read that question. It's about the dismissal of verified credentials in this panel, given that the primary approach being advocated is a peer-to-peer exchange with unique private public key pairs. With zero knowledge proof, and he just goes on to explain multiple blockchain technologies. And so that how is this exposing or making anything available to a corporation or government? He's missing something there. That's what Steve says. He would like Steve to answer that question. So if Steve, if you want to take it on.
Yeah, hey Phil, good to hear from you. Thanks for the question. Look, I don't dismiss verified. Look, I certainly don't dismiss verified credentials out of hand. There are some ideas in verified credentials that are actually very sound, very actually technology neutral. They've been around for a long time. There's two things. I think if you're trying to make a claim about something, whether it's where I live or how old I am, or whether I've got a corona vaccination. I think everybody agrees now, one of the weird things about self-sovereign identity is that we don't want people to attest to these things themselves. Almost every single thing that's important that you need to know about somebody is a fact, right or wrong, that is vouched for by somebody else. Now we can get into all sorts of arguments about hierarchies and authorities and where do you get your facts from, and that, but the point is that if you need to know if somebody's vaccinated, then don't trust me, trust my doctor. So For 30 years, there have been ways of taking a fact about somebody and recording who's vouched for that fact. So that's one thing. And you know, we talk about provenance. It's one of the new ideas in blockchain, but it's actually a very old idea. The second thing is control and proof of possession, for example. Like if I'm going to present the fact that I have a vaccination certificate, how do I control that? And you want some geometries, you want some topologies where that's presented peer-to-peer, where there's relatively little leakage, there's relatively little breadcrumbs. I mean, we all know that as well. Now that to me is actually also an old problem. And to me, it's about smart data carriers. There's lots of technologies out there. And if you look at the evolution of credit cards from stupid pieces of paper from the 1950s through magnetic stripe technology, through to chip technology, and now through to not just chips, but things that are wrapped up with geolocation sensors and history and all sorts of metadata. What we've been doing for 50 years is getting smarter and smarter about the way that people control locally in their own self-centralized way. They control the facts that are known about themselves, and how do you make those facts known to other people? So this pattern, I mean, the pattern replicates all over the place. So what I'm trying to do in my storytelling there is to talk about the objectives and the patterns, and to get away from the idea that anything in the last 5 years offers any magic spells here. When you try and get a chain of custody or a chain of provenance, like who says that I've got the vaccination certificate? Once you've got that under control, and once you've given me a smart data carrier where I can control the release of that data, and it's called a wallet in blockchain technology, the blockchain itself becomes fairly uninteresting to me. And maybe Harry and I could be talking about the way that certain ledger technologies, new ledger technologies, non-public permission technologies, they can provide some useful additional security outcomes. But by and large, I think that this comes down to endpoint technology, and there's lots of ways of doing it. So, you know, Phil, I hope that adds a bit of nuance. I don't dismiss. I think the idea of verified credentials, I think the W3C work is producing some new protocols that are basically a new version of what used to be X509. I think the DID specs that W3C are also working on, I think the DID spec is just a new lightweight public key certificate. And as such, it's pretty cool. And if it becomes a widespread technology capability, great.
Yeah, to jump in and then, sorry.
Yeah,
I would go.
Okay, you want to go first?
Over.
Sure.
Guys, we've got about 2 minutes left on this, so let's keep things a little bit short if we're able.
Yeah. So I just want to jump in and answer Phil's additional question there. I don't think a blockchain adds anything to this, and I don't think a blockchain is a good idea for this. You don't want to have the data around forever in whatever form. You want to have it while we're in this form of crisis, and then you want it to go away at some point. If we need a longer term infrastructure, we need to think about that in another way. But what we're building an emergency response, we should plan for it to be a temporary emergency, not a permanent emergency.
Yeah, and I mean, as former W3C staff, you know, zero knowledge proofs sound great on paper. They rely on network transport. I'll be talking about this at Ready Layer 1. Network transport, even if you're quote unquote anonymous on chain, you can be de-anonymized by looking at network level transports and correlations. That's what de-anonymized Zcash with Kenny Patterson's ping reject attack. W3C DIDs carry along a lot of luggage, like the sort of dead W3C semantic web stuff is embedded in it. You know, I mean, just, you know, personally, like I find, you know, I wouldn't want to give IBM any of my personal data for processing from a European perspective. And I think it's dangerous to do so. So I think there's a lot of advertising, which is dubious, particularly around verified credentials. And I understand the desire for them, but I wouldn't recommend anyone actually use them. I think I would actually say that the technology should probably go to an actual functional standards body that knows about privacy in crypto, such as the IETF, and be reworked there with the people that, you know, rebuilt stuff like TLS and other standards, which have been improved a lot since post-Snowden, do have staff that understands cryptography and do have widespread participation, as opposed to like a fly-by-night operation, which is how I view the W3C DID initiative.
Awesome. Yeah, Steve, Philip just replied as well in the comment section. So there was a question on zero knowledge proof and how it relates to the privacy debate in the questions, or also there's the classic question about WhatsApp and Facebook end-to-end encryption. What about the backdoor access that the US government wants, even though the tech giants are pushing back against it? Anyone wants to reply to that question?
Greg, you want to jump in on that one? I believe you were talking about that initiative.
Yeah, I think we are seeing stronger and stronger pushback against strong encryption from certainly the Five Eyes countries, the English-speaking countries, and increasingly from other European countries. Germany and France are now kind of on board with this idea that we can't have strong encryption. So it's not just the US. So I really do think that disinformation is going to be kind of the new arrow in the quiver of the people who are fighting against it. The first message was going dark and law enforcement can't see terrorism planning. I think now it's going to be, we have conspiracy theorists and misinformation being spread in encrypted chat groups, and we need to get in and stop that. And I think these are really dangerous arguments, and they appeal to our desire for safety in times when we're afraid. And I think, yeah, it absolutely is a huge problem. It shouldn't be tolerated, and we need to be very aware of that going forward. We can't be distracted by coronavirus. There was this initiative that was launched immediately before kind of the crisis called the Earn It Act. I can't remember what the letters in it stand for, but essentially it's taking immunity for content posted by users away from providers that use end-to-end encryption, that don't provide this backdoor access. And I think these pushes are just going to get stronger. It's ongoing throughout the crisis, so we can't take our eye off the ball.
Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, this can go on. There's a 15 minutes break before the next panel on mental health and psychedelics, which will be really interesting. But if anyone wants to ask more questions, we actually have another question. Anonymous attendee saying, does the digital immunity pass directly enable things like the known traveler digital identity? Anyone wants to
Can you say that again? They make the...
Does the digital immunity pass that we touched on before directly enable things like the known traveler digital identity, which might mean like enable things like the government's knowing every citizen's locations and journeys?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to make a high level standpoint here. So I think there is true. There's a long-standing desire, which I think, can be enabled to some extent by zero knowledge proofs of what's called selective disclosure. So that's, I disclose certain facts of myself to one party and different facts to another party, and I control those facts. And I generally agree with that approach. It's not clear if current standards, I'd say they don't, really enable that approach without centralized authorities, without leakage of dangerous metadata. And I think the real problem is that there's been this huge hype over identity, which predates blockchain. It goes back to OpenID and this really crazy system invented by the same people behind verifiable credentials called XRIs. And a lot of this comes down to how the web works. So on the web, you have to have a website name, www.reseteverything.events or whatever. And so you buy that name, and that's a lot of money, right? There's a lot of money going around the domain name system. And I think what originally motivated a lot of people that were interested in digital identities, they said, well, why can't I be the guy that sells identities? Or why can't I sell identities for my company or whatever? Then I make that money, right? So I think even though there's this rhetoric of self-empowerment around digital identity, a lot of the early technology, I have a long paper on this I published, I'll put the link in the channel, was really about this kind of desire to compete with ICANN. You see stuff like Handshake still trying to do this. I'm not even sure. It's fine, why not? But then at the same point, I don't know why I should trust Handshake more than ICANN in terms of like a domain name and a web browser resolving to a server that I want to visit. But I think where the fundamental contradiction comes into play is essentially the conflict between identity and privacy, that people want to resolve this conflict, but I don't think you can. I think you can basically build systems which enable privacy, enable some form of selective disclosure, but you don't want to build systems which, based on a rhetoric of empowerment, enable digital identity to such a case where you have to be identified, that you are identified, and that even maybe you can sort of say, oh, well, I can disclose to who I want. You still have some sort of digital passport. And I think the digital passport notions is something that a lot of governments want, a lot of immigration agencies want,
Yep.
a lot of people want, and a lot of the reasons are based on efficiency. And it's crazy how many databases your traditional government has, and they do cross-border stuff. It gets even crazier. That being said, I think it will almost certainly be a step backwards. And in the age of Corona, I think that the likelihood of it being abused or outweigh the gains that, and maybe efficiency, or allowing more people to make money than currently make money off identity. I think it's really dangerous. And
Could I add to that?
Push back.
Could I add to that, Ben? Very, very simply, I realized some time ago that identity, the art and science of identity management, is about what do I need to know about you, Ben and Harry and Greg, to be able to deal with you. And privacy is about what do I not need to know about you guys to still be able to deal with you. And privacy is about restraint. The thing that's not technological about privacy is that it's about restraint, and all identity technologies are fundamentally in tension there. Now, I don't think the tensions are fatal always, but there's always this pressure, literally like an osmotic pressure within identity that is necessarily going to go against privacy. It's an uncomfortable truth, but I think Harry's called that out really neatly.
And I think from a policy perspective, when you create a credential of some sort, you create a need for other people to ask for it. So I can say that, no, Steve, no, Harry, I'm not going to show you my digital passport or one of the credentials in it. And you say, fine, I'm not going to deal with you. So by creating this thing that exists, we create a need for companies, for governments to demand that we have it and to demand that we present it in order to interact with them. So if we are going to create these things, we need to make sure that there are protections built in that limit what people are actually allowed to ask for and create actual enforcement when they do demand it.
And I think that's definitely a good point. I'm just interjecting because I have to move on to my my next thing in the rest of my day. So I wanted to say thank you, Harry, Greg, and Steve for obviously joining us, and Alex for hosting this. And everybody enjoy the rest of the conference. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Fascinating. Cheers.
Yeah, like we went way over time, actually. It was supposed to be a 15 minutes break, but that's really amazing that we had discussions going on. So yeah, feel free to still ask questions. Attendees, you can raise your hand. You can reach the Q&A box. And in a bit less than 10 minutes, we have a panel on mental health issues and treating them with psychedelic-assisted therapies, which will be super interesting. So yeah, in the next, I guess, 5 minutes or so, we can still answer privacy-related questions from the previous panel. So someone asked, Q&A box, there's an immense push coming for ID 2020. It is obviously tied to a big business, mass vaccines, Microsoft, Gavi, thoughts? Yeah, you may or may not have to reply to this, I'm not sure.
I don't think big vaccine is actually a very profitable industry. I think
Yeah.
I think this idea that there is a huge profit push from pharmaceutical companies to create vaccines is just patently false. I do wonder if it's a good idea to have passports for vaccinations if they're not being offered for free to everyone. But if they are being offered for free, I think it's maybe a good way to show that you are vaccinated and you can return to work.
Right. Yeah, we touched on this actually earlier in the day, with a vaccine being a non-repeatable business, right? Because you get vaccinated once and then it's forever. It's a really bad business model. And there's also, like, actually privacy-wise, there's a question about whether we should, once and if the vaccine will be available, will it be perpetrated by governments via voluntary cooperation or mandatory cooperation, meaning like the vaccine has to be done to everyone, and so that kind of maybe crosses the line of privacy to people. What do you think about this? So voluntary versus mandatory rules for the vaccines for like public health concerns.
I'm for voluntary vaccination as long as we have enough uptake that we create effective herd immunity. I think when you start getting a situation where you have outbreaks of diseases that have been thought basically eliminated, we have a problem with people not getting vaccinated. So I think I don't have as much of, well, I don't think it should be mandatory on a population level, but for certain professions, certainly, for people who are going to be dealing with the public in any capacity, I think like nurses and doctors, teachers should probably be required to be vaccinated.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, makes total sense. And probably like those people are the ones willing to do it voluntarily anyway. Cool, awesome. Is there any more questions?
I think that I just want to make one point, which is there is this herd immunity question, and I think there's a lot of the desire for mandatory vaccination identity systems come from the desire that we can track and control these diseases, and I'm not sure if that will always be the case. So I'd like to question the premise of that, particularly when, like with Corona, at least maybe outside Australia and a few other lucky places, it's already probably fairly widespread. But then at the same point, it's also clear in countries where it's widespread that there's no herd immunity, that there's still the majority of the population probably doesn't have it. So that's why I think it's a little bit depressing, but I kind of feel we may just have to get used to these biological pandemics, and that a lot of desire for technology to shortcut this may not work in the long run and in the short run. So that's why I'm very nervous about sacrificing civil liberties and privacy in general, is because I feel uncomfortable. I mean, in the beginning, I think we might be able to have pulled it off, but now at this point with Corona, I'm pretty sure that's not the case, that the sacrifice that we make for the future generations may outweigh the benefit for the present ones.
Awesome. Nice. So, a couple more questions popped up. No, just thank you messages. Okay, cool. I guess we can slowly start to wrap up. Thank you so much, Greg and Harry, for the discussion. It was really interesting. I saw Stephen Ben left. So yeah, amazing. And we'll look forward to what you do in the privacy industry and space.